I might do even. Welcome back to Simply EDU, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to get a 1600 on the SAT. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how to get an 800 on the reading and writing section of the digital SAT. Now, before I even get started, I know some of y'all might be wondering why I'm not finishing the ACT series, and the reason for that is that the SAT is literally in 2 days, and so I feel like it's more important to finish this series first before I go ahead and make the rest of the ACT series. So, as usual, I have a video overview here. Basically, it's just a table of contents of all the things we're going to cover in this video. First, my prep and really my experience with the SAT. Then, general tips and strategies. After that, all these topic areas you can see here. And at the very end, I'm going to do a walkthrough where I'm going to do all the even-numbered questions in one module of a practice test. So, first for my prep, I'm just going to go ahead and do it on this slide. I took the May digital SAT and I got a 1600. Now before that, I'd taken the SAT one other time, and that was back in August. On that test, I got a 1570, which was 800 math and 770 verbal. Now, that means that yes, the May SAT was my first official digital SAT, but that's not like my first digital SAT ever, right? Before that, I'd taken the PSAT, and on that, I got a 1520. Now, in terms of how I study for the test, the May SAT really isn't the best one you want to do if you want to prepare well for it. Obviously it's during AP season. But what I did is the night before my SAT, I took 2 practice tests, and that's really all I did to prepare for this. That being said, please don't do that, right? You shouldn't be taking tests the night before. And if you're going to do that, don't take 2, right? It's really not good, especially if you're trying to sleep at a healthy time. But that's what I did. Try to space out your studying when you're going to prepare for the test. With that being said, let's get on to the general tips. So first, for some general tips. Now, the first thing is guessing. So I know that there's probably some situations you encounter in the test where you just don't know what the answer choice is at all. Tough luck. If you're in that situation, what you can do is you can count. Basically, go through all the questions that are in the section so far. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to the reading and writing section. This specific tip can also be applied to math. And that's that. So let's say there's 27 questions in each module, right? So divide that by 4. There should be around 7 for each answer choice, right? Like 7 questions with answer choice A, 7B, 7C, 7D. Now, actually it should be 6, 7, 7, 7, but you get the point there, right? So let's say that for every other question, I know the answer. I'm pretty confident in it. But there's one question that I don't know yet, right? And let's say that so far I've gotten 5 A's, 7 B's, 7 C's, and 7 D's. Logically, the more likely than not, we should have an even number of every choice. Not saying that you have to, and this doesn't always apply, but generally you should have that. So if you totally don't know what to pick on that question, then go ahead and pick A, or whatever makes it the most even for all 4 answer choices. Next is testing order. Now, I think any of us who've taken this test already know that really the first half of the digital modules for each reading and writing is the harder part, right? That's where they have more of that poetry, reading comprehension, all that sort of stuff. So if you're struggling with finishing the test on time, one thing that you can do is just immediately start off at the second half of the test. Maybe question 15 or 16 and then go from there. Because after that is all the more easy questions, all the grammar and those questions at the end where it's you're researching a topic and it gives you all these bullet points. All those are pretty easy questions that you can blow by. So if you're really struggling with time, then go ahead, start at the middle of the test and go do those. Then go back to the end and do the remaining questions. And the final thing is skipping. And this is something that's really important. A lot of the time, we get down to 2 answer choices and we really can't decide. I myself have faced this situation numerous times. And what we try to do is just sit there and just keep thinking, try to figure it out. But at some point, you're not making any progress by sitting there. Just pick what you have and go on ahead. More likely than not, what you pick the first time around, what your gut answer, I guess, is usually the correct choice, right? You keep sitting there over and over again, who knows, you might have switched to the incorrect answer. So if you're in that situation, just pick your answer and move on. And if there's something that's also really hard, then go back to the first tip, right? Maybe see, okay, I haven't picked any A's yet. Go ahead, pick A, right? Or if you're down to 2 choices, you don't know which one to pick, then again, pick the one that helps satisfy that answer choice need, right? don't linger too long on a question. It's not going to help you. Now, for our first actual topic, vocab. I'll admit, this one is kind of hard to give really good advice for, because at some point, you just got to know the words, right? Now, more likely than not, when you see a question, if there's 4 choices, you're probably going to know at least 1 or 2 of the words. If you don't know any, then tough luck. But hopefully you do know a few of them. And I guess the main things to look out for here are prefixes and suffixes, right? Usually using these, if you know what the stem of a word means, then adding on that prefix and suffix can help you figure out what the new word means. And I think this is pretty common sense. I think we all know this, but this is just something you got to keep in mind. Another thing is plug the answer back into the question. I know this sounds a lot like a math tip, but I promise it works. Go through each choice and put it back into the blank and read the sentence as you hear it. And then hopefully one of those words when you read the sentence just sounds good to you. That might not work all the time, but just try it out. Maybe one of them fits better. Maybe their connotation fits the sentence better. Who knows? That's another thing you can try out. And the final thing is more of just a general tip that really helps with all of the reading and writing section, and that's just to read a lot. I know that, now I personally didn't do this, but I know what a lot of people do is they might read New York Times articles or Times magazines. They have good articles in there that can help you train a lot of vocab and also help you with sentence structure, grammar, punctuation, all sorts of things. So that's another tip that can also help you out. Next is poetry. Oh boy. So the main thing here is to read the blurb. They might say let's say the main character's name is Neil, right? Oh, Neil is a student in high school. Maybe that can help you out with understanding what's going on in the text. So there's been some questions where I'm rushing through the test on the practice test and I didn't read the blurb and I got the question totally wrong. But if you just read the blurb, it's so obvious what the choice is, right? So make sure you read that. It really helps to contextualize everything that's going on in the passage. After that is to analyze every answer choice. And again, this all seems pretty common sense, typical test taking strategies. But the reason this especially works with poetry because a lot of the time they're not going too abstract in there, right? It might be oh, what's the main purpose or what's the main idea of this thing? So applying these test taking strategies that you see on the screen here really help you to narrow down what the correct answer is. After that is a table-sized data for claims, and my approach for this is pretty similar to how I would approach a science passage on the ACT, and that's to skim nearly everything, right? So but it's important that you first read the table though. Now, don't read the actual numbers if you don't need to, but read the axes and the labels of each axis and the title. That helps you to understand what's the table and the data actually about. And then after that, the majority of the paragraph, just skim through it because first 2 lines are probably just telling you what's going on in the table, but you've already done that by reading the axes, right? Then they might give you some other thing, oh, we're scientists at the University of Chicago, right? But then the final sentence, which is usually the hypothesis, is what you really need to pay attention to because that is what they usually are going to ask you the question about. So make sure you read it and understand it thoroughly, and then maybe go back to the data and see which data is talking about what the hypothesis is talking about. After that is research studies / conclusions, and this is kind of similar to what the data, but this one is more like the questions where they gave you maybe 2 hypotheses or just a long paragraph, no data, no graph, nothing, right? So for these, if there's 2 paragraphs, then make sure to read the claim of each study. And sometimes they might give you study 1, study 2, or scientist 1, scientist 2, right? So make sure to read scientist 1 and both of them thoroughly, but a lot of the time they might want you to analyze the relationship between the 2 scientists. And what's important to do there is pay attention to the transition words. Usually scientist 2 will talk about what scientist 1 talked about and then have a transition word to lead into what their own ideas are. So make sure to pay attention to that because that can really help you get the answer choices easily. And anyway, just make sure to understand each claim thoroughly. That's the main thing with these questions. After that is transitions. Now, if the slide seems similar, it probably should because this is almost exactly what I did for my ACT English slide because fundamentally they want you to do the same thing, right? Understand the relationship between the 2 parts, so whatever comes before the transition, whatever comes after the transition, and then use the transition word that accordingly fits, right? So if the sentence that comes after it is adding on to the previous one, then use the word of addition. If they're contrasting, use the word of contrast. and on and on. You can see all the different words here. And again, it's important that you try to know as many of these words as you can. And along with test taking strategies, again, you go through practice tests and you see a word you don't know, right? Like let's say I'd never seen specifically before. That'd be kind of strange, but let's say you haven't, right? But when you go through all the choices, you know for sure that the following sentence is an example sentence. Therefore, process of elimination forces you to pick specifically as the correct answer. From then on, you know that, okay, specifically is a word that is an example transition. So keep that in your memory and use that so that the next time you see it, you know, okay, specifically means I'm adding on an example. So hopefully you'll know whether to cross that choice off or not. Next, you have punctuation. And before we even talk about all these punctuation marks you can see here, we first need to talk about what a clause is, right? So an independent clause is basically something that can be a standalone sentence, right? So it has, a subject and a verb. And then a dependent clause is something that cannot be a standalone sentence. It has to be with an independent clause to be a sentence. Now, with that being said, we can go talk about each of these punctuation marks. So first we have a comma. Commas separate items in a list. Clauses, and if they're followed by a fan voice, they can separate two independent clauses. Now, fan voice is just an acronym for the words for and nor, but, or, yet, so. So if I want to separate two independent clauses, I could go comma and or comma yet. If I'm doing comma and, usually I'm doing addition, but if I'm doing comma yet, it's usually contrast. So keep that in mind as another way that you can do transitions. Now, I guess an example of a comma to separate items in a list would be, you can bring pens, pencils, and erasers to the SAT. Then a colon. So a colon is usually in the structure independent clause, dependent clause, right? And one thing to keep in mind is that the dependent clause after the colon is allowed to start with a capital letter. It's not always going to do that. It's kind of rare that you see that, but they might throw that in there. So keep in mind that it's okay, it's allowed, like it's fine if they do that, right? Now, I guess an example you could do is that there are 3 utensils you could bring to the SAT. Pens, no, 3 utensils you could bring to the SAT, colon, pens, pencils, and erasers. Next, we have dashes, and an M dash is a long dash, and it functions pretty similarly to a colon, right? So again, it can separate like another part of the sentence that's related to the first part of the sentence. And it can also serve as a parentheses, right? But if it's going to serve as a parentheses, make sure that there's an M dash before and after the parenthetical information. Then you have an N dash. Now these are shorter and they usually function to replace the word to. One example could be that, like from May N dash June, meaning May to June. After that we have semicolons, and these are in the structure independent clause with a semicolon in between. Again, you could start like the second independent clause with the capital N. So one thing to keep in mind is that like periods also separate two independent clauses, right? So if you see 2 choices and it's like basically the same thing, but the only difference is that one is with the semicolon and the other is the period, usually they're interchangeable, so you can cross both of them out because they can't both be correct, right? Now, another thing that semicolons do is that they can function like commas in that they can separate items in a list. Now, usually they do this because like the individual items in the list already have a comma in them, so then you're not going to use more commas to separate them, right? You're going to use a semicolon instead to distinguish between the different items in a list. So keep that in mind as another way that you can see a semicolon. And as I just said, periods, of course, separate 2 independent clauses. Now, what I noticed is that the SAT typically tests like commas, colons, semicolons, and periods. They don't test dashes as much as they used to, and definitely not as much as the ACT. That being said, still make sure you know them, right? I don't want to lead you guys in the wrong direction. Who knows, maybe the June SAT is full of those. So keep in mind that you should know all these, but especially the 4 that I just mentioned. Lastly, we have the researching the topic questions, and for these, especially if you're low on time, don't read all the bullet points / the text given. Usually the way these questions are structured is that they give you some context, then all the bullet points that the student got from doing research, and then the question. The question's usually like, oh, the student wants to write a paper on this topic, or emphasizing this part of the person's life. Which information is most important to provide, or something like that, right? In those situations, usually you don't need to read all the bullet points because the answer choices are true. In those cases, yeah, just pick the choice that fits what the question's wanting the most. But don't always do that. Like if you have a good amount of time, then make sure that every choice is actually true and like following like information that the student found out. And the reason is that I've seen some questions where they actually just make it false. Like they'll give you some information that the student did not find out. So make sure to keep that in mind when you're answering these questions. But in general, yeah, you don't need to read all that text. And that's it for this video. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment down below on what your favorite part was. Hope this video really helped, and stay tuned for part 2, where I do a walkthrough of a SAT reading and writing module.